Okay, here we go. Well, welcome everybody to another episode of Conspiracy in the Force. My name is Conspiracy Kyle, and on today's episode, I have a very special guest. I've discovered someone else that loves Star Wars as much as I do, and is in the kind of media realm, and is also willing to have some difficult and conversations about things that are happening in Star Wars and kind of in our culture nowadays. So I want to say hello to Stephen Kent. Hey, how are you doing this evening?
Conspiracy Kyle, very nice to see you. Thanks for having me on.
Absolutely. So for those who don't know about you or some of the projects and work you're involved in, can you kind of give everybody a little bit of overview about some of the stuff that you're involved with?
Oh gosh, so I guess I am a political commentator. I've been working in op-ed writing and TV news commentary for about 4 years, give or take. So I am an entertainment contributor to the Washington Examiner. I do occasional pieces for the Federalist, and I do TV political news commentary. So appearing on kind of all the big, TV news talkers, right, and doing shows and talking about the news. I also host a show affiliated with Al Jazeera called Right Now with Stephen Kent. It is Al Jazeera's first attempt to do something right of center, and it's a program with a political bent towards like libertarian and conservative thought. And I spend every minute of that show basically trying to explain the divides between libertarians and conservatives. And then on the side of all of that, I host a Star Wars podcast called Beltway Banthas, and it is a program about the politics of Star Wars. And I ended up turning that into a book, which I have coming out in November, called How the Force Can Fix the World: Lessons on Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness.
That's awesome. Yeah, can you tell me a little bit more about this book, because it sounds really fascinating. And from some of the content I've been watching of yours, one of your overriding concepts is, listen, there's a lot of political divide, obviously, in our world, and it's obviously seeped into entertainment. It's seeped into Star Wars, of course, by way of Disney. We know how that goes. But you said, at the core, Star Wars is supposed to be about fun. It's supposed to be about enjoyment. So tell me a little bit more about the book and kind of what inspired you to write that.
Absolutely. So the book is about political polarization and looking at the coming apart, not just of America, but I think in many ways like the Western world, and a lot of the things that used to bind us together, whether it be faith, shared religion, community, a sort of a shared sense of what the political equilibrium was in our country. A lot of those things have gone away. The world has changed a whole lot since the onset of the 21st century. And we share less and less as a people today. And in the news, you'll constantly hear them harping on, we've never been divided any such time, since the Civil War, right? You hear a lot of this talk. And so at its core, this book was about how Star Wars and my experience hosting the Beltway Banthas podcast, where I profile people left, right, center, far right, and far left about their love of Star Wars. They all were saying the same things about why they enjoy this story, why it inspires them, why it gives them hope, and why also it helps them understand people who are not like them. And so what I did was I looked at this lack of shared things that we had and basically said, if we were to draw on one thing that we could all share and talk about morality, right and wrong with, you could do a lot worse than Star Wars. I sort of do personally bemoan the loss of Judeo-Christian culture in our society here in America. I think it's bad for us that we've lost those things, but I don't have a magic wand to sort of bring people back to church. That's a really big problem, and I can only do that in my own household and in my own community. So what I'm really focused on here is why Star Wars makes us better people and gives us a lot of good things to talk about.
Right, and I'm 100% with you there, because there's so many different life lessons that you learn throughout Star Wars. For me, just the story of Luke Skywalker, all the things that he went through, as a young adult and becoming an adult, went through a lot of tragedies, right? Like a lot of us have gone through tragedies or terrible things in our lives. But I think it shows us that there is something on the other side, right? You don't have to live in a, victim-like mentality. You can turn your life around for the better. And at the same time, by proxy, hopefully you can affect other people's lives as well. And I think, Star Wars at its core is really about love, right? When you look at that
Correct.
penultimate scene in Return of the Jedi, what changed the universe was Luke Skywalker and his love for his father, and his father, coming back from this machine-like person. And I think, and you had mentioned it on some of your YouTube shows that, that's very core, and that's very important, that to show that nobody's ever too far gone. People can still be redeemed, no matter what they've done. I mean, you can talk about that in many different directions, but I think that's a great thing to show that there's a lot of redemptive qualities in Star Wars.
No, absolutely. And you're touching on a couple of main chapters in the book. So there's a chapter on the importance of empathy, and I really couch that entire chapter in how Rey and Kylo Ren relate to each other as sort of being alien to one another in The Force Awakens, right? It's the ability to see beyond the mask of your opponent. Luke, of course, does this for his father, Darth Vader, in the original trilogy. But I really wanted to kind of focus in one area kind of on the sequel trilogy. And I looked at sort of how Rey approaches Kylo from the moment that she learns that he's not, in fact, like some sort of robotic, ghoulish automaton beneath the mask, but in fact, a relatively cute young man who she might actually relate with in many ways. And then you kind of touched on, the question of hope. And that's one of the main things that ties all of Star Wars together, is this, this young man and you get this as well with Rey, like looking out at the twin suns of their planet and just wanting to be somewhere else, believing that there's more to life. And so all of this stuff that you're talking about with love, it's the thing that underpins the entire book. And what we have lost sight of in our own country is an ability to love one another despite certain things, that we have always sort of believed that because we have shared things in common, that's why we love each other. But I look at our culture and see that we basically, now that we have less shared things, we now think that we cannot love each other. But I write a little bit in the book about how the most godlike form of love, the most saintly form of love, is to love despite of those things that might alienate you from another. And we can get into all the specifics, but it's the main theme of Star Wars, and it matters.
Right. And what you touched on a little bit there about, just polarization too, right? Like you see this in politics. Obviously, left versus right is always the big paradigm we talk about, but then also in Star Wars, right? You have the fans of the original trilogy, you have the fans of the prequel trilogy, you have the fans of the sequel trilogy. And just like in politics, people think if you have a criticism about the sequel trilogy, that means you hate it and despise it. Or if you have a good thing to say about the prequel trilogy, that you love it and it's your most favorite thing. But we're complex humans. We shouldn't be put in these binary 0 or
Kyle,
1 kind of equation.
Don't even get me started on the accusations that whatever your opinion is on The Last Jedi, you're a Russian troll. It's exasperating. And this is why, and you mentioned kind of like the Disney era of Star Wars. And, I kind of have a little bit of a flippant attitude about it, because it's not my favorite trilogy. It's my least favorite of the 3 trilogies. But I was a kid when the prequels came out.
Same here.
I was a kid when the prequels came out. Episode 1 was the first movie that I ever saw in theaters for Star Wars. And episode 3 was the most picturesque and important memory that I have as a Star Wars fan. And do you think that when I went to the comic book shops and talked to the 20 and 30-year-old fans when I was a teenager about how much I love episode 3, I was treated with kindness? Like, no, I wasn't. It was an awful time to be a young Star Wars fan, because there was so much just anger and gatekeeping and all this garbage going on. And, even though I don't love the new trilogy, I always remember that, and I will never forget it. And my daughter, as she's watching these new Star Wars films, and she's kind of forming her own opinions, I just kind of refuse to participate in that dynamic that I found to be so aggravating and upsetting when I was a young fan.
Right. Because like newer fans coming in, the new sequel trilogy, this is their trilogy, right? Like in the mid 2000s, a lot of kids grew up, not even on the movies themselves, but like the Clone Wars animated series, that was their Star Wars. So it's like I talk about this with my friends and stuff all the time. It's like, you can't just superimpose your thoughts onto somebody else. You have to kind of get into their mindset. How have they grown up? How have they developed as a person? Like, what's their mindset? Because we all, like you said, we all have our are favorites and things like that. But just because it's my favorite doesn't mean it's the
Oh,
best.
totally. And it doesn't mean it invalidates like another person's thing. You know,
Yeah,
my
like
daughter
the
loved
prequel,
episode 2, right? That was her
right?
favorite. And now Star Wars Rebels is her favorite, the animated series.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and it's like, in that formative period, like when you're early teens to preteens, it's like those are the things that you remember in your mind forever. Like those are the things that are gonna stick, and there's really no way around that. So it's just, like you said, it's a preference, and I think we can all appreciate them for different aspects. And I do appreciate that in your book you are putting some of that good stuff from the sequel trilogy in there, because I think it is in there, but of course it gets buried with all of the other
Right.
talking
And
points.
yeah, and I think one of the things that I will always criticize the sequel trilogy for is that despite people have like strong opinions about the political agenda behind the movies and some of what was done with the characters, but one of the things that's really hard about the sequel trilogy and kind of incorporating it into my book was that George Lucas, he had such a vision with his 2 trilogies that he did for Star Wars. He had a through line and a point that he was trying to make with those films, from episode 1 to episode 3, and then episode 4 to episode 6. He had an idea. And the hard thing about writing critically and analytically about the sequel trilogy is it's just kind of transparent how much of it was like make it up as you go along.
Yeah.
And I had a friend kind of going back and forth with me on Twitter the other day about my analysis of how Rey and Kylo end up balancing the Force. And I believe it to be the case that they do, in fact, restore equilibrium and balance to the Force in a way that Anakin never really appropriately did. And it's reading into, the movie as deep as you can, trying to take every possible detail, putting aside your opinions of the films and just analyzing. And I really hold those opinions strongly. But at the same time, it's also clear that Disney had no idea what they were doing movie to movie. So it's one of those things that can make an analysis really hard when you're trying to pull what is the meaning of these movies when the makers are clearly not sure of what their meaning was either.
Yeah, and it's hard, especially when you don't see a lot of stuff specifically in the movies, right? Like I think there was a specific intent, specifically in The Force Awakens, to shy away from anything at all political. So you don't see anything about the new capital city of the galaxy until it's destroyed. So so go back to episode 4. You had an emotional response when you saw Alderaan being destroyed because Princess Leia had a connection to it. Her family was there. Everybody she knew was there. When this other New Republic capital was blown up, you really don't have that emotional resonance because you don't know anything about it. The only way to know anything about it is to go into all these supplemental materials like the comics and the books and stuff, which there's too many of them. Like all the books I have back here are from like 1995, and I haven't even read all those.
You're so old school, Kyle.
So like I think that's the hardest part, and I think there's new books coming out still trying to understand and explain the whole Palpatine thing, how he came back and this and that. And like you said,
somehow Palpatine has returned.
Somehow that's literally my favorite line. I tell that to people. I'm like, listen, this is a line from the movie. I'm not making this up. I'm not paraphrasing. This is an actual line. So it was definitely a fly by the seat of their pants kind of thing. So I'm with you there about the analysis of it.
No,
so
go ahead.
Go ahead. So the reason I wanted to have you on is there's a very interesting article that came out several weeks ago about the term Jedi that you had made some video responses to and some articles written about. So if you could, for those listening and watching that weren't familiar with this article, can you give us a little bit of insight about this article talking about the Jedi from the Scientific American newspaper, I guess?
Yeah, so a couple of geniuses with master's degrees and 2 PhDs. It took 5 academics to put this article together. It's in the Scientific American, all right? This is a scientific journal that dates back to the late 1800s. It's got 100+ years of history and a really strong reputation, particularly in the secular scientific community. And so the Scientific American runs this article titled, "Why the Term Jedi is Problematic for describing programs that promote justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And then the subtitle is, of course, they're meant to be heroes within the Star Wars universe, but the Jedi are inappropriate symbols for justice work. Leaving you just to wonder, like, was it a slow news day in the world of secular science over the Scientific American for them to write this article? But if you really kind of understand kind of how wokeness and kind of critical race theory type thinking has permeated every higher type of institution, like the sort of most elite publications, journals, and also universities in the country, this is not at all surprising. So the backstory is basically this. There is an acronym, Jedi, Jedi, which has been used throughout the social justice community to brand diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. If you work in an office or you have kids going to a public school, you might have seen your public school district talk about having a diversity, equity, and inclusion policy, a DEI policy. This is basically, they say it's just kind of like a nice thing meant to make people feel more included, but it's really sort of steeped in critical race theory and sort of victimhood classes, and trying to elevate certain voices while suppressing others in the name of social justice. And I think a lot of far left activists thought it would be really fun if they added J into there, because you could re-scramble the word to be Jedi. And they did this. So J for justice. So justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And this ends up spelling Jedi. And in my own community, I have a Jedi program that goes on at the local school district. My city council has a Jedi council where they talk about all the diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives that they're going to do, but they kind of like do it in a Star Wars-y way. I'm part of a Star Wars club on Clubhouse, and one of the guys who co-hosts my club is a teacher up in Brooklyn, and he is one of the masters on the Jedi council for his school district. And no, I kid you not. And they talk about doing social justice work in these things, and they kind of all make it Star Warsy. But according to the Scientific American and these scholars, there is problematic history behind the Jedi, and therefore they should not be associated. We can get into a little bit of the details of why they think that.
Yeah, and it's one of those things, let me ask you this before we get into some of the details of it. Do you think that these wonderful PhD, super, super smart people believe all the words that they're writing here, or do you think it's more of a kind of a clickbait type thing that you would see on like BuzzFeed or something like that? Do you think they really believe all this stuff, or do you think it was just to kind of get clicks and to get mentions and attention? Because like
that's
they
a great
say,
question.
like they say, no response to this kind of stuff is bad. They're still getting the click on the article. So what's your kind of thought about that?
Well, I think it's important to note that none of these PhDs and masters, writers who are contributing this article to the Scientific American work at the Scientific American. They wrote an op-ed together from a scholarly point of view, and then they shopped it around, and the Scientific American said yes. So it's not their concern if they're getting traffic for the piece. It's not meant to be clickbait as far as the writers are concerned. Maybe the Scientific American said yes because they knew it would generate a lot of traffic for them. But for the writers who did this, I think there's no reason to assume that this was not done completely in earnest. And they've defended themselves quite vivaciously on Twitter against all the criticism. People who I think subscribe to this diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative kind of mindset, they're very serious and they believe what they are talking about. Now, there are a couple different planks of the argument that these writers come together. How many masters does it take to screw them in a light bulb or write an op-ed kind of thing? They make a couple different arguments against why Jedi is not appropriate for an acronym to be doing social justice work. Let's kind of break it into two things. One, they make the argument that Star Wars is problematic. And they kind of go through a laundry list of different offenses that the Jedi commit in the actual Star Wars universe as being bad arbiters of politics and also justice. And then they also go after Star Wars for all of the ways in which it's sexist, racist, all, name all of the ist and isms boxes that are going to be checked. And then they also make I think, a compelling argument that social justice activists should not be associating a corporatized brand like Star Wars with the work that they're doing. And I'm actually of the belief that the second half of the article, there's some merit to what they're saying, which is like, if we're serious about diversity, equity, inclusion, and social justice, we shouldn't be playing games with acronyms, right? And making this sound like it's adventure time. It's not. This is serious. I don't agree with anything that they do, but I actually think that if you take yourself seriously, that's a very good point.
Right.
But
now, let me say this before we get into some of those elements. The concept itself of diversity, equity, inclusion. These words on their own in a vacuum, good things, right? There should be diversity, there should be equity amongst people, there should be inclusion of all kinds of people. But I think the problem is when it's the woke side that is using these, it's anything but those. It's diversity, equity, inclusion for their side only, right?
Mhm.
They would not provide the same type of inclusion to, like you mentioned before, somebody with Christian values, or that maybe that has beliefs about, let's say, abortion or some other polarized topic. They would not afford the same kind of inclusivity to people that have those beliefs. So the whole purpose, I would say, behind it is invalid, because it's not true diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Do you agree?
No, I absolutely agree. I ended up in a meeting with the superintendent for my public school district because I testified, or went up to the podium and spoke at one of my school board meetings, and pretty much gave a 60-second takedown of the motives behind their DEI initiative, which they were going to pass. And the superintendent called me into a one-on-one meeting, basically just to like lecture me after the fact. And their viewpoint is that this is about bringing more voices to the table, making sure that everybody can participate and be included. And my response to that is, of course, were people not included? Are you excluding people from being able to be part of the way that the schools run? Are you stopping people from being able to succeed in school? And they go, no, of course not. We're not discriminating against anybody. Then I go, well, then why is there a problem to fix? You yourself just said that there's a problem within the school district of exclusion and discrimination, but they don't take responsibility for that. What they want is to change the way that schools are run, what is being taught, and sort of micromanage the message of every single classroom, even all the way down to math and whether or not you are supposed to answer problems correctly. There is a very strong strand of belief, and it's working its way through California school systems right now, that math is subjective and that it is rooted in white supremacy and that you don't have to have correct answers. And then that is sort of a colonialist attitude. This is real stuff. And it's one of those things where, like, it's not Fox News fodder in the morning. Like, go to your school board meeting. They're serious about this stuff. So no, it is not about bringing more people to the table. It is about changing the scope of what is true and false in the school system.
Right. And when you take diversity, and one of the best examples I've heard is, think about like a band, right? You can have a band that has 5 white people. You can have a band that has 5 black people. You can have a band that has 5 people of different cultures, backgrounds. Just because of the inclusion or non-inclusion of different people, it doesn't make the music that they're doing any better or worse. It's when you talk about diversity in like a check the box type thing, right? Where they're starting to say like, well, we need to have this, and they're really just doing it as a virtue signal,
and
right?
You have to block people out of that process. I mean, if you Google Fairfax County Thomas Jefferson High School in Fairfax County, in the name of diversity, equity, and inclusion, has been removing opportunities for their Asian American students to participate in certain programs in the school to make room for other people who are not actually interested in being part of those programs. It's a majority Asian school, and they're basically doing everything that they can to make sure that Asian Americans are not thriving and getting into the best classes in the name of equity, right? Like making sure that the same amount of every type of person is in every class. Which is, of course, not opportunity. That's not equality. That's just this new sort of dogmatic idea of equity. And it's entirely different from equal opportunity.
Right. And you definitely see that in the NFL, right? They have this Rooney Rule, which says that for every coaching position, you have to have one minority candidate, right? So what they do is they bring in that candidate with no intention of them even being part of the the final pool, right? But they have to do that. So it's almost a slap in the face to those people that are being brought into interview, because some of them probably know to a certain extent, I'm not even really being truly considered for this, but because they have to adhere to this check the box diversity, I got to be dragged through this process, and it's insulting to that person.
Yeah, it is. I was just watching Mad Men the other day, and there's a episode in season 5, right in the beginning. One of the other PR firms in town on Madison Avenue gets into trouble for basically dropping bags of water on Black civil rights activists, and it generates really bad press for their firm. And so the Mad Men crew, Donald Draper and the likes, they run an ad in a major newspaper saying that we're an equal opportunity employer. And so then they get a bunch of Black applicants in their firm the next day, and then they actually look at each other and they're like, oh, we have to interview people. And it was humiliating for all of the people involved, because they knew as soon as the people who put that ad about equal opportunity employment there, that they were interviewing them to make sure that they didn't get bad press, to make sure that they weren't going to be in trouble when in the culture war at the time. But none of them actually had a decent and fair shot at getting the job, and it was humiliating for everyone involved.
Right. Yeah. It's a crazy concept. So yeah, let's start going through some of those different tenets of the article there.
Okay. Yeah. So
this is where the fun begins, right?
Yeah, the Jedi are inappropriate mascots for social justice, they write. They're ostensibly heroes within the Star Wars universe, but they are a religious order of intergalactic police monks, which, is true, prone to white saviorism and and toxically masculine approaches to conflict resolution in, quote, violent duels with phallic lightsabers and gaslighting others by means of Jedi mind tricks. I mean, this is the kind of stuff that when you've had a couple of drinks at a party, and like we all, like Star Wars fans, we get a little tipsy, and we talk to our friend like, like it might actually been the Jedi were the bad guys the whole time. Oh, Jar Jar Binks might have been a Sith Lord, and we're just like having fun, right? It's just like tongue-in-cheek kind of arguments that you might make about who's right, who's wrong. Like it's the whole Empire. Maybe the Empire were the good guys thing. The rebels were terrorists. People make these arguments all the time in Star Wars fandom, but there's a whimsical nature to it. You kind of know most people are doing an academic exercise. But in this case, they're true. Like they make this argument in a sincere way to basically say that the Jedi are not heroes, which of course is not true.
Right. Yeah. And the whole white saviorism piece is just is such a joke, because you look at the Jedi Council, it has all different races, all different colors. Okay. Look at the Sith is the complete opposite. The Sith, if anybody listening has like read through some of the novels, read through like the Revenge of the Sith novel talking about Count Dooku. He was like the most aristocratic, eugenicist type person, noble bloodline. He was using all these aliens as pawns in this war, but hopefully he was going to kill them off in the end. Yeah. So, I mean, I think if you want to talk about white saviorism, I think you need to talk about the Sith and not the Jedi.
I'm looking at the Jedi Council at the time of the Phantom Menace. There is 8 people on the council. There are 8 people on the council. You know how many of them are actually like a white person, I guess? 2 of them, and both of them are aliens and don't even look human, but they have pale skin. I think Obi-Wan Kenobi in episode 3 might have been like the first like cis white male addition to the Jedi Council in ages. Not that I care. I don't care about these things, obviously, but it's just a ridiculous claim that these people kind of put forward, tying together their gripes about their whatever they think colonialism is to the patriarchy, which the Jedi are sort of the vanguards of society and civilization in Star Wars. And so they just sort of connect these 2 dots, right? If the people who we hate, Christopher Columbus is white savior of civilization, right? Then obviously the Jedi are too. They connect these dots, and they don't do it humorously.
Yeah, and you mentioned in one of your videos that you put out, you said, this article is really the attack on the Jedi, like as an establishment, right, as an institution. But you need to look at the character motivations within there. Look at somebody like Qui Gon Jinn, who was not on the Jedi Council, who I would argue was probably the most noble Jedi out of all of them, because he was willing to take chances on people and aliens and creatures that nobody else would. Jar Jar Binks, obviously, for one. And in the Phantom Menace novel, Obi-Wan was griping about how they would go on these missions, him and his master Qui-Gon, and Qui-Gon would always be trying to help or, assist, crazy little creatures or something. So the whole premise of that white saviorism is absurd.
Yeah, and there's an element of the Jedi's moral sins that I think are important and fair to discuss, and it's one of the things that led Anakin Skywalker and Count Dooku to the dark side in the first place. And Qui-Gon is a pretty good example of, even though I think he understood the moral corruption of the Jedi Council, how it was sort of in bed with the Republic politically and not invested in justice and peace in any real sense. This is what drove Dooku to work with the Separatist movement and the Sith in the end, and Qui-Gon was his student, so you have to imagine he got some of this as well. But when they arrive on Tatooine and they come across Anakin Skywalker, and he's having this conversation at their dinner table, and he says, "We didn't come here to free slaves." There's an aloofness to the Jedi that is wrong. It's revealing to Anakin at a very early age that they are not dedicated to justice. They're dedicated to the political status quo and running errands for the Republic. And this is absolutely true. And it's why the Jedi were wiped out. So there's this kind of claim basically made in this article here that the Jedi were failed heroes. And we know that. That's the whole point of the prequel trilogy. Right. That's the idea. There's no one's hiding the ball that the Jedi basically eventually gave into sort of moral bankruptcy. But they've also been around for 8,000 years, and they were champions of the light and justice and peace and what was right. But in that final 100 years from the High Republic to the beginning of the Empire, they became something that they were not, and they became morally baseless. And so it's true to say that, but it's sort of wrong and disingenuous to say that the Jedi as an institution were not heroic. All we did was see them in their decline.
Right. Yeah. Just because they lost doesn't mean that there's a lot of, it's a cautionary tale, in my opinion. Right. And it's the same reason why, we shouldn't be going around the country tearing down statues of people who did horrible things in the past. We need to remember history, and we need to learn from it. Otherwise, like the quote goes, it's going to repeat, or it's going to, I prefer to say history rhymes.
Right. And Kyle, you've been watching Star Wars Visions on Disney Plus.
I did, yes.
It's just absurd, and it's like the white saviorism thing too, and just saying that they're not heroes. To look at Japanese culture and all these amazing Japanese studios taking the Jedi lore and spinning them into these amazing and beautiful original stories of young children and a rabbit child, apparently, dreaming of this hero, this icon, this idea of who the Jedi are, and picking up that sword, turning it on and saying, "This is the weapon of a Jedi Knight." And they're not concerned with politics. They're concerned with who is it that goes out and slays dragons? When raiders and marauders come to my town, who's going to save me? We tell stories of the Jedi. The Jedi were once the people who did this, and they were in 8,000 years of galactic history. It's only in that final run where we see that they're errand boys for the Supreme Chancellor and whoever's in power. And it's a tragedy, but it completely obscures the point. And for me, who criticizes the progressive movement every day, it's basically their inability to grapple with the sins of people who come before them. They're utopians. They believe that everyone must be perfect for you to look at their ideas as worth preserving. The Jedi's ideas are on their own beautiful and inspiring, but the Jedi Order, the institution, rotten to the core. That's not a secret.
Right. No different than, one analogy I like to use is like, think about like the Catholic Church, right? The Catholic belief systems and things on their own are really, really good, and rooted in scripture and this and that. But the institution themselves, we don't have to get into it, but I think we all know some of how that has fallen over the last, I don't know, whatever 100 years or something to that effect. You could even say a few hundred years, but that doesn't take away from the concept behind it. Just because people have hijacked it or propagated it for their own uses doesn't mean that underlying purpose is invalid.
And it's all done for a reason. I mean, the tearing down of heroes and the gross over moralization that the kind of writers that wrote this thing in the Scientific American, that they're doing it for a sinister reason, and it's to have a world where we have no heroes, where everybody is flawed, everybody is sinned, and because they are sinned, their statues cannot be up. You cannot aspire to high ideals because, well, that person chopped down a cherry tree when they were a kid, or that person owned slaves in a time where it was completely socially acceptable to own slaves. We all know that people who do things wrong in the past are imperfect, but we look to their ideas, to their writings, what they said versus what they did sometimes, and try to make sense of what the truth is. And this little like petty attack by academics on the Jedi, it's all part of the same thing, which is that at the end of the day, these far left progressives want to be the heroes. They want to be the people who, with their credentials, their degrees, and their expertise, they are the only people left for us to look up to and bow down to and follow. But as long as you have the idea of the Jedi Knight, right, of the hero who takes the sword up to go fight krayt dragons, they're never going to be as powerful because we have other things to aspire to. So it's just all part of a methodical way of stripping down everything that has value in our lives, from faith, family, to myth, so that they are the only thing left standing in the end.
Right. Yeah. It's like you think about in, communist regimes and things across the country, they want to take out the arts. They want to take out music. They want to take out that critical thinking type stuff. So you can definitely kind of see some of that seeping in here. So what's the next piece of the their wonderful equation here?
So the next piece of their argument, going beyond the Jedi, is to basically go after Star Wars itself. Right. So they basically go on to talk, one, about the gatekeeping of the community, that it has sort of a sexist reputation, which, may or may not have been true. I think it might have been, particularly in the 90s and early 2000s when we were younger, but we just don't live in that world anymore. And that's also not a reason for people to not have Jedi councils in their community to do justice work. It's just very silly. But the argument that they basically make is that Star Wars is problematic, that it has perpetuated ableism through the lens of Darth Vader, that Darth Vader is an icon for why disability makes you inhuman, for why having mechanical limbs makes you less of a good person, and that there is an Orientalist subplot to Leia being taken by Jabba the Hutt and kept as a slave in his palace, that this is some sort of like white supremacist idea about foreigners who take the white woman and then put her into slavery. I mean, it's just so contrived, and I kind of feel like it's not even worth dignifying with a response, because everybody who thinks seriously about these things and recognizes that this is a space opera are not going to go down that road.
And the thing about the slave Leia thing too is that's also another very important tale to tell, because the symbolism of her choking Jabba to death with her chains, I mean, I think that visually, I think, tells you a lot about breaking the chains of slavery. So the fact that she was in it, I think what's more important is that she broke out of that, right? Like just what we're talking about, having heroes and having heroes do heroic things. She did a heroic thing. She physically got herself out of slavery on her own.
She's the Hutt Slayer,
right?
And this is something that like feminists have done in the Star Wars fandom, which I think is like fine, honestly. Like ever since we were kids and we would get all the toys, right? There was Slave Leia, like it's like capitalized, like Slave Leia, like that's a thing, right? On the toy box, that's what it would say. And I get why that's a little bit demeaning, right? Like that's not who Leia is. And then in one of the more recent Star Wars books, the Disney Star Wars books, one of the characters refers to Leia as Hutt Slayer because of like the legend around her name. And so a lot of women in Star Wars fandom have sort of taken to saying, we don't talk about Slave Leia, we talk about Hutt Slayer Leia. And you know what? Cool.
I'm down with that. Yeah.
That's fine. I like that's totally cool. And it's just kind of ridiculous to say that because there are these like complicated things in Star Wars that it's not a heroic or interesting tale. And I think that kind of takes us to the third plank of their argument, which is that Star Wars and the Jedi are corporate entities in and of themselves, right? That Star Wars is a corporate property, that the Jedi, by extension, are Disney IP at this point, which I suppose is true. And if social justice activists who are distrustful of corporations, distrustful of organizations like Disney, want to be taken seriously, they shouldn't be commodifying their commodities at Disney as part of what they're doing. And I think there's some merit to that argument.
Yeah, I would agree. And you even saw that in, the prequel trilogy as well. You saw that the corporatism on the, Trade Federation side, and Lucas definitely had a huge issue with that combination of, from that perspective, from government joining with the corporations to accomplish these goals and objectives. So I definitely appreciate it from that perspective. I'm with you on that.
No, I think it's something to like put yourself in the shoes of a left activist. My brother's a left activist, and I love him dearly, and I respect his viewpoints. And I talked to him because he's kind of like a Bernie Sanders guy, and I was running this by him, and that was kind of the area in which he was like, yeah, that's the part of the argument that does make a lot of sense. Is every Jedi Council meeting that you have for diversity, equity, inclusion at your school is basically building up the brand of Disney and basically driving people over time to go buy lightsabers and go to Disney World. And if you're a serious left activist, you should kind of be a little bit reluctant to blend those two things together. Doesn't mean you can't love Star Wars, but it just kind of means you don't cross the streams, right? And I think that has a lot of merit to it. And I just kind of wish that this article, which I think thrives on sensationalism and trying to stir the pot of Star Wars fandom, just kind of made a more principled argument about keeping social justice and corporatism separate, because that seems completely credible to do.
Right. Yeah. You don't really need a popular kind of spin on it. If you're doing good work and it's got an acronym, whatever, continue to go along with that. So yeah,
do your thing.
Right. Yeah. So in the end, I'm with you there. I mean, maybe they're right. I think their conclusion is that it shouldn't be used. Yeah, I agree with that conclusion, but their points along the way to get there, a little bit of a rocky road.
Yeah, their conclusion is basically to tie all these different pieces of evidence, right, together about why it's bad for Jedi to be used as an acronym for diversity, equity, inclusion, plus justice. And they say, put simply, quote, the baggage of Jedi and Star Wars is too heavy to burden our justice-oriented initiatives, and it may actually undermine our efforts. If we feel that we need to have an abbreviation for labeling our commitments to diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, there are alternatives available to us that don't involve fighting over whether or not the Jedi were heroes. And that's a wonderful point to make. And it's not something I'm just saying because I am pretty libertarian and I don't want to see Jedi dragged around the mud of these diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. If they want to do that, fine. But it's a sort of contortion of what is a serious idea into something that they're trying to make kiddish, and I don't think it's appropriate.
Yeah, I'm with you there. So as far as kind of Star Wars goes, in the mythology itself, what do you think kind of about the future of Star Wars from here? I think, the sequel trilogy's ended. I think they're going to try to somewhat distance themselves from that for a little while, just like you kind of saw that with the prequel trilogy. They tried to distance themselves from that for a little bit just because of immediate backlash. Maybe 10, 20 years we'll think about it differently. But yeah, where do you think kind of Star Wars is going from here? I mean, my God, there's 35 different new shows in production right now or something to that effect. So where do you think it's going and what are you most excited about?
Yeah, so I think where it's going is a la carte, right? It's going to be more of a buffet where you can put together the sort of Star Wars that you like and just have a really damn good time being a Star Wars fan. There is, and this is part of why I wrote How the Force Can Fix the World, is that as part of having less shared things as a culture, it is really hard today with a story as emotionally charged as Star Wars, with as much nostalgic baggage as Star Wars has, 40 years of history, to get everybody, all four generations together in a movie theater, give them the next chapter in the Star Wars Skywalker story, and expect everybody to be happy with it. That's really, really hard to do. And I think it was a mistake to start the Disney era in that way. I truly, I reject very strongly the notion that Disney has ruined Star Wars. They made a bad trilogy, but like everything around it, I think has been awesome. I've been having a
Yeah.
great time with the standalone movies, Rogue One that fills in the gaps between two movies, Solo, which I thought was going to be awful, actually ended up being pretty darn good all around. It was a beautifully made movie. And the animated series and the standalone shows, Mandalorian is just like the beginning of what I think is going to be an amazing run of Star Wars. But it's just like in this time where you're trying to make everybody happy with a big trilogy story, I don't think it could be done. I don't think it was possible. And people talk about like Luke, right? Like Luke was down and out on the island of Octo. And my view as a 31-year-old with a 10-year-old daughter is that I related to that moment that Luke was in. I felt that. And I was like, you know what? I've been kind of down lately, and I kind of feel like I've been on the island, and I'm looking for inspiration to get back out there. And that's a defense that like the pro Disney side will make all the time. They'll say like, this is reality. Sometimes you fall down and you need to get back up again. And then you'll have fans saying, I needed a hero. I needed Luke with the green lightsaber because I'm 50 years old. I'm not happy. I needed someone to say, you know what, go out there and still slay your dragons. And that's why I loved it so much when Luke came out in The Mandalorian with the green
Yes.
lightsaber and eliminated those dark troopers. And I felt strong again. I get that. And I just think it was a mistake to try to do the trilogy when we all need different things from Star Wars as a fan base.
Yeah, and I'm totally in agreement with you about a lot of the ancillary non-film, non-Skywalker trilogy pieces have been incredible. And you mentioned Solo. That's one I've only watched probably 2 or 3 times. Like I need to go back and watch that because I think there's probably a lot more good in there than is it. But I think the problem with the response when it came out, it was coming around on the heels of The Last Jedi within 6 months.
Yep.
So there was so much baggage placed on it that had nothing to do with the story or anything else in itself, just because people had such a bad taste in their mouth that they weren't willing to accept anything that came out in that time period. So that's when I need to go back and revisit. And one thing I will say too about that Mandalorian thing you said. Yeah, I think that they gave us that moment, right? They knew that that's what the fans wanted, and I wouldn't call it fan service in a corny, cheesy way. It was the right thing for the story at that time, and they were able to get that to us. And I think it was such an impactful way that they did that, and I'm so happy that they did that.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to go back and talk about from the article again. I just thought about they mentioned this concept of the Jedi or the Star Wars being ableist, right? Where Darth Vader was bad because he had all these mechanical attachments and things like that. And I think the mechanical stuff is besides the point to the story of Darth Vader. It's about losing your humanity. It really has nothing to do with the machinery itself. It's just saying he had truly become a different person, and he basically had to wall himself off in this, steel casket, for lack of a better term, out of his guilt and shame and all this stuff. So there's more to it than that. And then the other side too, look at somebody like General Grievous. Okay, he was same kind of thing like Darth Vader. He had he had like a human heart, but he could do everything. He could do everything with all his cybernetic attachments. So you can see that kind of stuff on both sides of the spectrum. But
Yeah, I
there's a
mean,
greater story to be told with that, other than saying like because he was more machine than man, that made him a bad person. No, he was a bad person before that.
right.
That's it. This is just a
That's what
physical
Obi-Wan
representation.
says. Like
Yeah.
Obi-Wan says that. And Obi-Wan in many ways was wrong. And that's again like them, they read the text of Star Wars and then they take some of the things completely out of context. When Obi-Wan is saying he's more machine now than man, it's just as much true as when he said that your father was like a fighter pilot and was killed by Darth Vader. No, Anakin Skywalker is still in there, and Obi-Wan had given up hope that he could be saved and that there was still a person in that armor. Obi-Wan was wrong. And Luke, the hero, is the guy who actually was willing to look at the suit of armor and say, "You're my father. You're not this hunk of metal and evil." And he was the one who was validated correct in the end. So like this, again, this argument that they waste 2 paragraphs on about the ableism thing, it just is like they didn't watch Star Wars. It's just like they read Twitter and then they wrote an article.
Oh gosh, yeah, that can get you that can get you into trouble right there. So okay, so before we end here, and I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come on here and chat with me. This has been great. What would you say is your favorite Star Wars movie, your favorite Star Wars character, and then your favorite quote from the movies?
Yeah, so my favorite movie is Return of the Jedi. It is purely for the finale scene between Luke, Vader, and Palpatine when Luke is being tortured by the Emperor and Darth Vader's watching, and you see in that silence as he's just watching that moment of realization. I live for that moment in Star Wars. It's so beautiful. And that for me, even though like Empire Strikes Back's great, like that just buys it all for me. So Return of the Jedi is my favorite movie. It's the most hopeful. Qui Gon Jinn is my favorite character. He is the Jedi that I would want to be. He is like the Jedi Master I would also want to have. And I'm also a green lightsaber guy. Whenever I think about myself in Star Wars, it is wearing dark robes and having that awesome green lightsaber. So Qui-Gon is the one for me. Favorite quote. I would like more time to think about it, and you tell me yours while I pull one out of the sky.
So yes, let me think here. I think it would definitely be that, what I call like the dark side spiral, right? Fear to anger to hate to suffering, because you can apply that template to so many things happening in our world. You can apply it to everything that's been going on with COVID. You can apply it to everything that went on last year with riots and things like that. And there's so many other examples of that, especially in Star Wars, right? That fear. Anakin feared losing his mother. He feared losing his wife. And because he had that initial fear and he made decisions based off of fear, that led him to a dark place, which got him into that suit. So, and I think a lot of people in the world need to understand that, fear on its own is not a bad thing. But when you start making rash decisions based off of that and don't use critical thinking, you're going to be in a heap of trouble. So, and from the quote, it's a quote from Yoda from the Phantom Menace, which people at the time hated. But
Yep.
go back, and especially like you mentioned about Qui-Gon, so many great quotes from Qui-Gon in there too, that you go back and watch. Like, man, that
The
was some
ability
really
to speak
good.
does not make you intelligent.
Oh man, we don't have enough time to put that to people in our world.
I know. Yeah. I think for me, I'm not going to say this is my favorite quote because I feel like favorite quotes, like it depends on what you need on any given day. Last night I was driving with my daughter home from an event that we were at, and my daughter is very curious about civics and politics, and we were talking about This Is How Liberty Dies with thunderous applause, because we were talking about Congress and how they do nothing and how they give away all their power to the president every 4 years. And so we were talking about that, and that has a lot of value. We should always be talking about that line. But today I was spending some time with my kid, and I just kept thinking about, as I was watching her do some of her work, we are who they grow beyond. We are what they grow beyond. It's what Yoda said to Luke in The Last Jedi about Rey and our Padawans and learners. And boy, is that true. That is
Yeah.
the burden of a parent. It's the burden of being a master, is that you're not looking for your Padawan to like just learn what you have learned. You're looking for them to outgrow you. You're looking for them to have
Yes.
more. It's when your parents say, I want you to have everything that I didn't have when I was a child.
Right.
And that's true. And I think about that a lot. So that's been the one that's on my mind lately.
And I think, a good companion line to that is what he told, Obi-Wan and the students in Attack of the Clones, truly wonderful, the mind of a child, uncluttered.
Yes. Yes.
Uncluttered, I think is, it gives me chills just thinking about that, because I look at my kids, they're very young. They don't really know a lot of this crazy things that are going on in this world. And I look at them and they're happy just to play with a toy or to watch Sesame Street or this and that. I'm like, man, like they have the best life because they are not burdened by all the things we fight back and forth about, whether they're legitimate or not. It has such a burden on us and it weighs on us. Even if we try to not focus on it, it's still there. So I love that about seeing my kids just playing and having fun and not realizing that kind of a lot of some things in the world are crumbling.
Kids are where it's at. I truly wonderful. The mind of a child is the quote that is underneath episode or chapter 1 in my book. So chapter 1 of my book is on humility, and it's on why we have lost humility in our culture, and why the story of Padme in episode 1 and how she led Naboo back to peace from the Trade Federation was a masterclass lesson in humility. And I tie it all back to truly wonderful, the mind of a child is in episode 2, and a lesson from the book of Matthew in the Bible about why Jesus says we need to have the minds of children if we are to be good leaders and followers of Christ. And it's just something I think about a lot. So I do hope people will get the book, because that will be one of the quotes that leads things off.
Awesome. Yeah. So I want you to give your plugs again, but I will say, hey, Qui Gon Jinn, I would say he's probably the most libertarian out of any of the Jedi. He was more in that gray Jedi space, I would say. So I think you picked a pretty good one there.
No, absolutely. I think him, Qui-Gon and Count Dooku, they are in many ways the libertarians of Star Wars. And I, people will laugh at me when I say Count Dooku is a libertarian of Star Wars, because they're not libertarians and they're like, he's a bad guy. Well, I go, yeah, it doesn't really matter. He saw that the Republic was broken. Like Count Dooku was one of the only people that saw that the Jedi and the Republic were in cahoots against the best interests of the galaxy, and it was a morally bankrupt regime. And so that's one of the areas in which I'm like, yeah, Count Dooku is like one of the libertarians of Star Wars, and Qui-Gon just was not willing to go by some of the rules and participate in the corruption as well. I think it's somewhat true that Qui-Gon said, or that Count Dooku said to Obi-Wan in episode 2, I wish Qui-Gon was still with us, because I think he would have joined the separatist movement. He might have. I don't think he would have joined the dark side, but I think he would have left the Jedi Order.
Man, we need to get one of those Star Wars what if, like they did with the Marvel. That would be a really interesting concept to see where that could go. I think there's a lot of good meat on the bones there.
That would be really good. Yeah.
So before we sign off here, if you give everybody kind of your links where they can find you on social media, and then kind of plug your book and some of your other stuff again.
Yeah. So best place to find me is on Twitter at Stephen_Kent89. That's Stephen with a PH _Kent89. And I would love to talk to you about Star Wars or politics. My YouTube show right now is Stephen Kent is on YouTube. That's youtube.com/rightly AJ. That's Rightly AJ is the handle. And it's a weekly political talk show. This week, our guest is Mark Pellegrino. He's the actor who played Lucifer in Supernatural and Jacob in Lost. And he also was in Dexter and Quantico, big time actor. So he's on our show this week if you want to come watch that. And my book is called How the Force Can Fix the World. And it comes out here on November 9th. And I would love it if you would go ahead and pre-order it before it comes out. It will help us make a big splash on opening day.
Awesome. Yeah, everybody go check that out. I'm going to pre-order that. That's going to be awesome. I love Star Wars content. I love Star Wars commentary, and I love your take on it. Willing to talk about some of the wokeness and some of the other stuff, but also just talking about, like we started off the show, Star Wars is supposed to be fun. Star Wars it was originally meant for kids, and we can get a lot of really good stuff out of it, and we can kind of push some other stuff to the side. So definitely really looking forward to that book. So for Stephen Kent, this has been Conspiracy in the Force with Conspiracy Kyle, and may the Force be with you.
And with you.